Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere you've probably already seen on the news, on a viral video, or maybe just in a nightmare you can't quite explain. Tonight we're talking about monkey dust, a drug so cheap it costs less than a cup of tea, so strange it makes people climb buildings, and so disturbing that even the police in the UK admitted they weren't entirely sure what they were dealing with. Not metaphorically, they literally said that. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here, and a genuinely warm thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. You keep recommending these things, and I keep falling down the research rabbit hole at 2 a.m, which is exactly where this channel lives. If you're listening on Spotify, welcome. The link is in the description. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan, get comfortable, and maybe tuck your feet under the blanket. Not because it's cold, but because once I start describing what monkey dust actually does to the human body, you'll feel better with your toes covered. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what a drug looks like when it's designed by nobody in particular, regulated by nobody at all, and sold for £2 on a street corner in Stoke-on-Trent? Have you ever wondered what happens to a human brain when it gets hit with something that isn't quite cocaine, isn't quite meth, and isn't quite anything the scientists had a name for yet? Have you ever wondered what it feels like to have no pain, no fear, and absolutely no interest in coming down, ever? Did anyone think to ask, when they were synthesizing these things in a lab somewhere, what happens if this gets loose? Spoiler, it got loose. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the United Kingdom, sometime around 2017, in a neighbourhood where the unemployment rate is high, the housing is rough, and a small bag of white powder just appeared on the scene that cost about the same as a bag of crisps. You don't know what's in it. Nobody does. That's kind of the point. Before we get into the chaos, let's take a breath and talk about what monkey dust actually is, because a drug that makes people climb buildings and bite police officers is a description, not a definition. Monkey dust is the street name for MDPV, methylene dioxypyrovalerone, which is, if you're following along at home, a synthetic cathinone. Cathinones are a family of stimulants derived from the cat plant, a leafy shrub chewed for mild euphoric effects in parts of East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula for centuries. MDPV, however, is not mild. Think of it as what happens when a chemist looks at a leaf and says, "I wonder how far I can take this." The answer, it turns out, is very, very far, and not in a direction anyone should be proud of. Here's the thing about synthetic drugs that doesn't make the news quite as often as the footage of people climbing lampposts. They are, in a very literal sense, nobody's fault and everybody's fault simultaneously. MDPV was not cooked up in a basement by a cackling villain. It was synthesized in a laboratory, probably by someone with a legitimate chemistry degree, following a logical chain of molecular modifications that started with something entirely natural. The cat plant has been part of human culture for at least 1,000 years. Its active compound produces effects comparable to a strong cup of coffee, sociable, mild, manageable. MDPV took that basic structure and stripped away everything manageable about it. What you're left with is a white or off-white powder that looks, in all honesty, like nothing much. You'd walk past it at a customs desk and not blink. It has no smell to speak of. It could be baking powder, or a vitamin supplement, or the crushed remains of someone's ambitions, and yet in a quantity smaller than a match head, it is capable of overwhelming the human nervous system so completely that the person consuming it temporarily loses access to fear, pain, the concept of height, and in many documented cases the capacity to register that other people exist. That's not a metaphor, that's pharmacology. MDPV's defining characteristic, the one that separates it from most stimulants in the known canon, is the sheer aggression with which it blocks the reuptake of dopamine and norepinephrine. To understand what that means, imagine your brain's reward system as a dial that goes from 0 to 10. Alcohol might nudge it to a 3. Cocaine pushes it to a 7 or 8. MDPV doesn't push the dial. It removes the dial entirely and replaces it with a speaker pointed directly at the part of your brain responsible for motivation, pleasure, and the feeling that everything is fine and you could probably handle anything. The problem, and there is always a problem, is that a speaker cranked that high doesn't just play music loudly, it destroys the equipment. The body is not designed to sustain that level of neurological activation. The systems that process dopamine become flooded and then depleted. The receptors that normally regulate the feedback loop, the ones that tell your brain it has had enough and should probably sleep now, stop functioning. What you experience in the short term is euphoria so intense it feels almost cosmically significant. What you experience in the medium term is psychosis. What you experience in the long term, if there is a long term, is a brain trying to remember what normal felt like and finding the memory gone. There's a particular irony in the name monkey dust, a name that sounds playful, almost cartoonish, like something you'd find in a toy shop rather than on a street corner in Stoke-on-Trent at 2 a.m. But that gap between what a drug is called and what it actually does is not an accident. It is a feature of the synthetic drug market, which has always understood that a name can be a disguise. Monkey dust sounds harmless. Monkey dust is not harmless, and by the time most people found that out, they were already very much involved. To understand how monkey dust ended up on the streets of northern England, you need to understand the quietly terrifying world of novel psychoactive substances, what the media eventually started calling legal highs. Starting in the early 2000s, a global pipeline of synthetic drugs began flowing out of laboratories, primarily in China, designed to mimic the effects of controlled substances while technically existing in a legal grey zone. The trick was simple. Take a known drug structure, tweak a molecule here, swap a chain there, and suddenly you had something that did more or less the same thing as cocaine or methamphetamine, but wasn't, strictly speaking, cocaine or methamphetamine. By the time governments identified it, scheduled it, and made it illegal, the chemists had already moved on to the next variation. Think of it as a game of regulatory whack-a-mole, except the moles are wearing lab coats, and the mallet is parliamentary legislation that takes between 12 and 36 months to enact. Every time a government made a specific compound illegal, a slightly different version appeared. Same effects, different molecular fingerprint. Technically legal again until further notice. The lawyers called it analog exploitation. The chemists called it progress. The people consuming the results called it a lot of things, most of which can't be repeated in polite company. The legal high market in the United Kingdom was, by the early 2010s, genuinely enormous. Head shops in high streets across the country were selling these substances openly, often in brightly coloured packaging with names like Cloud9 and Bliss and Happy Joker, names that did approximately as much work as monkey dust in obscuring what the product actually was. They were sold as air freshener, as plant food, as bath salts. The labelling said not for human consumption, which is the regulatory equivalent of writing definitely not a speed camera on a speed camera. Everyone knew what they were. The legal fiction was thin enough to read through. The UK government eventually responded with the Psychoactive Substances Act of 2016, which took a dramatically different approach to the problem. Instead of banning specific compounds, it banned the concept. Any substance capable of producing a psychoactive effect in a human being, with exceptions for alcohol, tobacco, caffeine and medicines, was made illegal to supply. It was a blunt instrument. Critics pointed out that it would be essentially unenforceable, that the definition of psychoactive effect was almost comically broad, and that it would simply push the market underground rather than eliminating it. They were largely correct on all 3 counts. What the Act did do was close the head shops. The open, cheerful, over-the-counter, legal high market disappeared from high streets. What replaced it was a street market, less visible, less regulated, more dangerous, and significantly cheaper to operate. No overheads, no storefront, no branding, just product and distribution. Monkey dust arrived into this newly reorganized underground market like a gift to everyone selling it. Extraordinarily cheap to acquire, extraordinarily powerful in effect, and exactly the kind of thing that finds its customers very quickly in communities where cost is the primary criterion for a decision. The revolution nobody asked for had found its latest product, and it was £2 a bag. The lesson the legal high era taught, or should have taught, was not simply that specific compounds needed to be banned. It was that a market built on chemical novelty cannot be regulated compound by compound, any more than you can stop a river by picking up the water one handful at a time. The UK's eventual move to a broad-spectrum psychoactive substances ban was an acknowledgement of this, however imperfect in execution. But the move came late, and the infrastructure, the supply networks, the customer base, the economic logic that had made cheap synthetic drugs attractive in the first place, had already been constructed. The revolution was over before most people realized it had started. What remained was the market it had built. If monkey dust has a hometown, and every drug disaster has a hometown, it's Stoke-on-Trent, a city in the English Midlands that spent much of the 20th century as a powerhouse of pottery and coal, and spent much of the 21st century watching those industries disappear. By the time monkey dust arrived, Stoke was already dealing with high rates of unemployment, underfunded public services, and the particular kind of social exhaustion that settles into a place when the work dries up and nobody replaces it with anything. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place a cheap, powerful, and deeply destructive drug tends to find first. Monkey dust didn't cause Stoke's problems. It landed in a wound that was already open. To understand Stoke is to understand something about post-industrial Britain that the country has never quite managed to say out loud in a way that leads to policy. The potteries, as the area is known, built an identity around making things: Wedgwood china, Royal Doulton, the kind of ceramics that end up in museums and country houses, and the better sort of charity shop. At its peak, the pottery industry employed tens of thousands of people across the 6 towns that make up Stoke. Then came automation, then offshoring, then the slow arithmetic of global manufacturing that found cheaper hands elsewhere. The factories closed, the jobs went. The communities that had organised themselves around those jobs did not simply reorganise, they contracted, and the contraction took everything with it: the pubs, the clubs, the community centres, the informal structures that hold a place together when the formal ones aren't enough. By 2018, Stoke ranked among the most deprived local authorities in England. Life expectancy was below the national average. Child poverty rates were high. The housing stock included significant proportions of properties in serious disrepair. These are statistics, and statistics are blunt things. But what they represent is a texture of daily life in which difficulty is the baseline and relief from it, in whatever form, is not a luxury but a necessity. This is the environment into which monkey dust was introduced. The drug spread initially through existing networks. People who already knew each other, already shared the same corners and the same precarious accommodations, and the same experience of services that had been cut back until they were barely visible. It moved the way things always move in close communities, by word of mouth, by demonstration, by the simple and devastating logic of this costs less than anything else, and it works immediately. There was no advertising campaign, there was no branding, there was just the thing itself and the conditions that made it irresistible. What made Stoke unusual was not that it was particularly unlucky, but that it was unusually visible. The footage got out, the news teams arrived, and suddenly Stoke-on-Trent became, for a period, the shorthand for everything that had gone wrong, with drug policy, with austerity, with the communities left behind by economic change. The city didn't choose to be a symbol. It just happened to be the place where the convergence of poverty, cheap synthetic drugs and smartphones with cameras produced images that couldn't be ignored. The problem, of course, was that being a symbol didn't come with any additional funding. What Stoke also demonstrated was the inadequacy of ground zero as a concept for understanding drug crises. The phrase implies an epicenter, a point of origin, a place from which the problem radiates outward. But monkey dust did not originate in Stoke. It arrived in Stoke because Stoke had the conditions that made it viable. There was no patient zero, no singular moment of introduction that, had it been intercepted, would have prevented everything that followed. The drug was looking for places like Stoke. It found one. It would have found others, with or without Stoke. That is the thing about a crisis that is generated by structural conditions rather than individual events. You cannot contain it by addressing the place it first became visible. You have to address the conditions, and the conditions were national. Here's where the numbers become genuinely jaw-dropping. At the height of its appearance in Stoke, monkey dust was selling for approximately £2 a dose. £2. That is, to put it in perspective, less than a single-serve bag of crisps at a service station, less than a bus fare, less than most people spend on a coffee without even thinking about it. Heroin costs more. Cocaine costs significantly more. Even a pint of lager in a Wetherspoons costs more than a dose of something that would send you climbing up a lamppost at 3 in the afternoon. The economics of monkey dust were not accidental. A cheap drug in a poor area is not a coincidence. It is a business model. To understand why something this powerful could be sold this cheaply, you need to follow the supply chain backwards, which is a journey that takes you very quickly out of Stoke-on-Trent and very quickly to industrial chemical facilities in Asia. MDPV's precursor chemicals were, for a significant period, inexpensive and widely available. The synthesis is not trivial, but it is not extraordinarily complex by the standards of illicit drug manufacturing. When you're producing a substance in bulk, measured in kilograms rather than grams, and shipping it across the world in packaging that does not announce its contents, the cost per dose drops to amounts that make the street price of £2 not just viable, but actually profitable at considerable margin. Compare this to heroin, which requires poppy cultivation in specific climates, an elaborate processing chain involving multiple chemical stages, international smuggling networks with significant operational costs, and distribution hierarchies that each take their cut before the product reaches the street. Or cocaine, which needs a specific plant grown in specific countries, followed by an extraction process, followed by international trafficking, followed by cutting and redistribution. Each of those steps adds cost and risk. Monkey dust had none of those geographic constraints. It could be manufactured anywhere with the right equipment and shipped anywhere with the right labelling. The supply chain was short, cheap, and in the early days largely legal. For the buyer at the end of that chain, standing on a corner in Stoke with £2 and a need, the price was not just affordable. It was transformative in the specific way that price can be transformative for people making decisions under conditions of extreme scarcity. When every resource is stretched, when the choice between heating and eating is not a rhetorical expression, but a genuine weekly calculation, the cost of relief matters enormously. £2 was within reach for almost anyone, and that reach had consequences that no one had adequately modelled. There is something almost obscenely logical about it when you lay it out like this. The areas most devastated by economic decline produced the people most vulnerable to a cheap, powerful, immediately effective stimulant. The same processes of globalization and deregulation that destroyed the industries those areas depended on also created the international chemical supply chains that made the drug possible. And the austerity that followed the financial crisis of 2008 cut the services that might have caught people before they fell. £2. You couldn't design a more efficient trap if you tried. The most revealing comparison is not to other drugs but to other consumer goods. A cinema ticket in Stoke in 2018 cost more than a dose of monkey dust. A pint of milk cost the same. A single paracetamol tablet from a corner shop cost roughly the same. The things that were supposed to provide relief, entertainment, socializing, the small pleasures of ordinary life, were not dramatically more expensive than the drug. But they offered nothing like its pharmacological intensity, and they carried none of the specific functional appeal that stimulant intoxication provided to people whose circumstances were intolerable sober. £2 was not the price of a vice. It was the price of a brief exit from conditions that did not otherwise offer one. That is a different thing entirely, and treating it as the same thing is one of the ways the public conversation about monkey dust consistently failed the people most affected by it. MDPV works primarily by flooding the brain's dopamine and norepinephrine systems, and it does this with what scientists have described, with admirable understatement, as extreme potency. To put it simply, most stimulants tickle the brain's reward system. MDPV body slams it. It blocks the reuptake of dopamine with a ferocity that leaves other drugs looking polite. The result is a rush of euphoria, hyper-alertness, and energy so intense that users have described it as feeling bulletproof, not metaphorically, but in the literal, I cannot feel anything, I could run through a wall sense. The problem is that the same mechanism that makes it feel extraordinary makes it catastrophically hard to stop. Let's spend a moment with dopamine, because it deserves it. Dopamine is often described as the brain's pleasure chemical, which is technically accurate but somewhat misleading. It's more precise to say that dopamine is the brain's motivation chemical, the neurological signal that says that thing you just did was worth doing. Remember it and do it again. It fires when you eat, when you connect with another person, when you achieve something, when you hear a song you love. In normal circumstances, it fires in measured, proportionate amounts, creates a pleasant sensation, and then gets reabsorbed into the neuron that released it, waiting to be used again. The reuptake mechanism is the brain's way of resetting, of returning to baseline so that the next pleasurable thing can register as pleasurable too. MDPV blocks that reuptake almost completely. The dopamine that floods the synapse has nowhere to go. It accumulates and keeps accumulating, and the sensation it produces is so far beyond what any natural reward could generate that anything else, food, conversation, warmth, rest, the feeling of being safe, becomes temporarily irrelevant. You have been chemically convinced that you're already experiencing the best possible thing. The only problem is that it isn't real, and the brain, after a while, begins to notice. Norepinephrine, the other system MDPV hammers, is responsible for what you might call the fight-or-flight dial. It governs alertness, arousal, and the physiological stress response. Block its reuptake alongside dopamine, and you get a brain that is simultaneously convinced it is experiencing something wonderful, and convinced it needs to act on that conviction with immediate physical urgency. The result is a person who is simultaneously euphoric and agitated, who feels both invincible and under threat, and who, when the two signals combine in the wrong proportions, tips into something that looks from the outside less like drug intoxication and more like acute psychiatric crisis. This is why the clinical literature describing MDPV effects uses words like profound and severe more often than recreational drug descriptions typically warrant. This is not a drug with a dial that goes pleasantly high and comes pleasantly back down. It is a drug with a dial that goes to 11, and then, somewhere around the 3rd or 4th hour, begins actively corroding the mechanism that would allow it to return to 0. The brain, having been subject to this treatment, does not easily forgive. It wants more. It will ask for more in ways that feel less like desire and more like oxygen deprivation. And that wanting is where the real story begins. There is a phrase sometimes used in neuroscience that captures something important about what MDPV does to the brain over time. Allostatic load. Allostasis is the process by which the body maintains stability in the face of challenge, adjusting, compensating, recalibrating. When the challenge is chronic and severe, the cumulative cost of that recalibration, the allostatic load, damages the systems doing the adjusting. A brain repeatedly exposed to MDPV is a brain under enormous allostatic load. Every time the dopamine system is overwhelmed and then depleted, the recalibration that follows leaves the system slightly less able to perform the next recalibration. This is the neurological mechanism behind tolerance, behind escalating use, behind the diminishing returns that characterize the arc of addiction. The brain is not failing, it is adapting. The tragedy is that the adaptation makes things worse. In the summer of 2018, videos began circulating online that stopped people mid-scroll and held them there with a kind of horrified disbelief. Not staged, not fiction. Real footage, filmed on phones by bystanders in Stoke and neighbouring towns, showing people in states that no one had a clean word for. Some were motionless on the pavement, collapsed in impossible postures, apparently unconscious but with their eyes open. Others were staggering, arms extended, unresponsive to their surroundings, walking in slow, erratic circles. A few were climbing, fences, walls, signs, with a single-minded intensity that suggested they were either in great danger or entirely unaware that danger existed. The media landed almost unanimously on the word zombie. It was reductive. It was also, watching the footage, not entirely inaccurate. The climbing, specifically, became the image that defined monkey dust in the public imagination. There is something uniquely disturbing about watching a human being scale a building with apparent ease and complete indifference to the drop below, because it violates one of the most fundamental things we know about human behaviour, that we are afraid of heights, that our nervous systems are exquisitely calibrated to recognise the danger of falling, that the body reflexively protests any action that puts us at risk of it. To watch someone simply not have that response is to watch a person from whom something essentially human has been temporarily removed. It is deeply uncomfortable. It is supposed to be deeply uncomfortable. That discomfort is your nervous system working correctly. What was actually happening physiologically was this. MDPV floods the norepinephrine system to such a degree that the normal inhibitory signals, the ones that register pain, fear, and danger, are temporarily overwhelmed. The person climbing the building was not brave. They were not superhuman. They were experiencing a pharmacological suppression of the systems that would ordinarily tell them to stop. The bravado was not volitional. It was neurochemical. This is an important distinction, though it was not one that most of the coverage took the time to make. The footage spread with extraordinary speed, partly because it was genuinely shocking, and partly because social media is very good at moving images that produce strong emotional responses. By August of 2018, it had reached national newspapers, then international outlets. Sky News ran a segment. American networks picked it up. The phrase zombie drug travelled with the footage, and once a phrase like that attaches itself to a story, it is nearly impossible to dislodge. The word zombie strips the humanity from the person it describes. It places them outside the category of people this could happen to, and inside the category of terrible things that happen to other people elsewhere. This is a comfort. It is also, like most comforts derived from othering, false. Behind every piece of footage was a person with a name and a history, and, in most cases, a set of circumstances that had made the £2 bag of white powder on the corner feel like the most logical available choice. The cameras didn't generally capture that context. The cameras captured the climbing, because the climbing was extraordinary, and the extraordinary gets watched, and what gets watched gets shared, and what gets shared shapes the story. The story that got shaped was vivid, viral, and missing most of what mattered. The aftermath of the footage's spread had one effect that was neither wholly good nor wholly bad. It made the drug visible to people who had not known it existed. Some of those people were parents of young people in affected areas who then had a name for something they had been observing without being able to identify. Some were teachers, GPs, social workers, people in positions to notice and intervene at an early stage, who now had a reference point. Information is not neutral, and the information that monkey dust existed and did this was not purely harmful to have in public circulation. What was harmful was the framing that accompanied it, the framing that made the drugs users into spectacles rather than into people whose situation demanded and deserved a serious response. Accounts from people who have used monkey dust and survived to describe it, which is not guaranteed, paint a picture of an experience that starts as euphoria and ends somewhere in the middle of a horror film. In the early stages, energy, confidence, heightened senses, the particular delightful feeling of being interesting and capable. Then the tide turns. Paranoia creeps in, and it doesn't creep politely. It arrives fully formed and certain of itself. Users have described the unshakable conviction that they were being followed, that people around them were hostile, that there were entities in their peripheral vision that disappeared when looked at directly. The brain, running on synthetic dopamine, no longer has the machinery to distinguish threat from reality, and so it decides everything is a threat. Everything! Imagine waking up one morning and feeling with absolute certainty that you are being watched. Not a vague anxiety, not the normal background hum of social self-consciousness, but a specific, urgent, entirely real feeling conviction that someone is behind you, that the person across the street is not who they appear to be, that the car that just drove past slowed down deliberately. Now imagine that this feeling does not respond to evidence. You check, and there is no one there. The feeling does not lessen. It intensifies. You check again. It intensifies further. The checking itself becomes evidence of the threat, because why would you need to check if there were nothing to check for? This is roughly what an MDPV-induced paranoid episode is like, according to the accounts of people who have come through the other side of one, and it is not, it turns out, a particularly short experience. The half-life of MDPV in the body is long enough, and the neurological disruption it causes is severe enough that the psychosis can persist for hours after the last dose, sometimes significantly longer. The person is not on the drug anymore. The drug has simply rearranged the furniture of their neurochemistry so thoroughly that the normal process of returning to baseline has been substantially complicated. What this looks like from the outside, the pacing, the staring, the incomprehensible utterances, the sudden violent movements, the staring at nothing, looks to an untrained observer like madness. And in a functional sense, temporarily it is. The person experiencing it is not choosing to behave this way. They are not performing. Their brain has generated an entire parallel reality and is responding to it with the full emotional and physiological resources at its disposal. The tragedy is not just the experience itself, but the fact that the person is, in some residual way, still present inside it, capable of fear, of suffering, of the fragmentary awareness that something is deeply wrong, without being capable of doing anything to stop it. People who have recovered from monkey dust psychosis and talked about it describe two things consistently: the terror of the acute phase and the shame of the aftermath. The shame is often worse than the terror. You did that. You were the person on the pavement. You were the person on the fence. You were the footage. And then you have to live with that knowledge in a world that filmed it, shared it, and put a cartoonish name on it. The accounts of recovery from monkey dust psychosis consistently include one element that the clinical literature tends to underweight: the importance of being treated as a person during the acute phase and immediately after it. The people who describe the most navigable recoveries were disproportionately people who had encountered, in the worst moments, a nurse or a community worker, or even a police officer who had spoken to them as though they were still inside their own crisis, still a person deserving of dignity, still someone whose situation was recoverable. This sounds like a small thing. In a system stretched to its limits, treating everyone who presented in crisis with that quality of attention was genuinely difficult. But the accounts suggest it was not incidental to recovery. It was, for some people, the reason they came back. One of the features of monkey dust that police officers in Stoke kept returning to, sir, with a kind of weary amazement that made for remarkable news interviews, was the strength. Not the kind of slightly elevated aggression you might expect from a stimulant. The kind of strength that requires multiple officers to restrain a single person, that makes a standard hold ineffective, that sends trained personnel home with injuries from people they outweigh by 30 kilos. The physiological explanation is fairly straightforward. MDPV floods the system with norepinephrine, which triggers the same adrenaline-driven response as extreme fear, which means the body temporarily bypasses the internal limiters that stop us from tearing our own muscles. You're not stronger. You're just no longer stopping yourself from hurting yourself in the process of moving. The human body has a governor. It's not a metaphorical governor or a philosophical concept. It is a literal neurological mechanism that prevents your muscles from contracting with their maximum possible force, because maximum possible force would tear the muscle from the bone. You experience this limitation as normal physical exertion feeling hard. You push against it when you lift weights, when you run, when you do anything that requires genuine effort. The governor kicks in before you do yourself damage. Under normal circumstances, this is extremely useful. Under the influence of a massive norepinephrine surge, the governor does not kick in, and the result is a person who is, for a brief window, physically capable of feats that their actual muscle mass and body weight would normally make impossible. This was not a comfortable thing to manage with standard policing techniques. Officers described situations where multiple trained responders were physically unable to control a single individual of average build. Not because the person was particularly large, not because the person was particularly skilled in any fighting discipline, simply because the drug had temporarily disabled the mechanisms that would normally limit what a human body can do when it's determined to go somewhere or do something. Standard restraint holds rely, in part, on the compliance of pain. Apply force to a joint in a certain way, and the person being restrained responds to the pain signal by reducing resistance. MDPV, to a significant degree, turns off the pain signal. The hold stops working, the officer gets injured, everybody loses. Stoke-on-Trent Police's superintendent gave an interview in 2018 that circulated almost as widely as the zombie footage, and for good reason. He described officers who had significant experience with drug-related incidents being genuinely shocked by what they encountered on monkey dust calls. He described bites, scratches, and physical injuries sustained by officers who were trying to help people in acute distress. He described the operational impossibility of the situation. You cannot leave a person in that state alone. because they will injure themselves or others, but the standard tools for intervention were not working. It was, he said plainly, unlike anything they had dealt with before. That's a sentence that covers a lot of career experience. It is not a sentence you want a police superintendent to have reason to say. The strength issue also produced something that nobody in the coverage spent much time on: significant rates of injury among people on monkey dust themselves. The same neurological suppression of pain signals and physical limiters that made them difficult to restrain also meant they were frequently injuring themselves during episodes and not knowing it. Fractures went unidentified until the drug wore off. Soft tissue damage accumulated over the course of an episode. People were found afterwards with injuries they could not account for and could not, in many cases, feel yet. The body's pain system is not an inconvenience, it is a reporting mechanism. When it goes offline, the damage accumulates silently and presents itself in the emergency department hours later with compounded complications. The superhuman strength was, from the user's perspective, no protection at all. By 2018, Stoke's emergency services were fielding monkey dust-related calls with a frequency that was straining resources in real time. Paramedics who had trained for overdoses, cardiac events and road accidents were arriving on scenes they had no protocol for. A person completely unresponsive to pain, exhibiting signs of psychosis, possibly violent, with an unknown substance in their system, and no way to establish what dose or what combination. That is not a scenario any training manual had anticipated. The local police superintendent gave an interview in which he described officers being bitten, scratched, and attacked by people who appeared to feel nothing in response to standard restraint techniques. He said it plainly. It was unlike anything we had dealt with before. The specific challenge for paramedics was the problem of assessment. When someone collapses from a heroin overdose, the clinical picture is relatively legible. Respiratory depression, pinpoint pupils, reduced consciousness, and a treatment, naloxone, that works reliably and quickly. When someone collapses or goes into crisis from MDPV, the clinical picture is far less readable. The pupils may be dilated, the person may be hyperactive rather than unconscious. The vital signs may be alarmingly elevated rather than depressed. The standard overdose assessment tools don't map onto what's happening. And because monkey dust was often mixed with other substances, with alcohol, with opioids, with whatever else was available on the street that week, the picture was complicated further by the fact that you were frequently not dealing with a single substance at all. Ambulance crews described calling for police backup on medical calls because the patient, and this word deserves emphasis, patient was in a state that made safe clinical assessment impossible without physical intervention. Police described calling for ambulance support on public order calls because the person they were trying to manage was clearly in medical distress. The two services were each waiting for the other to take the lead on something that neither had been trained to handle. In the gap between those two jurisdictions, people were suffering. The toll on first responders was not just operational, it was personal and psychological in the way that consistently witnessing acute human suffering tends to be. Paramedics and officers described not being able to leave certain calls behind. The specific images, the specific sounds, the knowledge that the person they'd attended had been back on the street within 24 hours using again, because there was nowhere for them to go and nothing to change the conditions that had brought them to that corner in the first place. Compassion fatigue has a precise clinical definition. It also has a human one, and the human one was, by multiple accounts, being experienced by Stoke's emergency services at a frequency and intensity that nobody had asked them to absorb. There was a particular conversation that happened repeatedly, in various forms, in Stoke's emergency services during this period. A conversation that was almost always unspoken but was present in every briefing, every shift handover, every frustrated call between a paramedic and a ward that had no available bed. The conversation was about limits, about what a system designed to help people can do when it is not resourced to help the number of people who need it, about the particular moral injury that accumulates when you are trained to help, and willing to help, and prevented by infrastructure from helping at the scale the situation requires. None of the people on the front line of the monkey dust crisis chose its inadequate conditions. They showed up anyway. That deserves to be said plainly. MDPV's story in the United Kingdom is partly a story about the law trying to outrun chemistry and consistently failing. When synthetic cathinones first appeared on the market in the late 2000s, they were sold openly in head shops, packaged as bath salts, plant food, or research chemicals, labels that existed entirely to exploit the legal fiction that nobody was buying them to consume. Mephedrone, one of the earlier and better-known cathinones, was banned in the UK in 2010 following a moral panic and several deaths. But banning a specific molecule does not ban its cousins. Chemists simply shuffled the structure, and new variants emerged. MDPV had been identified and scheduled by the US Drug Enforcement Administration as early as 2011. The UK eventually brought it under the Psychoactive Substances Act of 2016, but by then the supply chains were already established. The mechanism of the legal loophole was not complicated, which is part of what made it so effective. Drug law, historically, works by naming things. A law says, this specific compound with this specific molecular structure is illegal. The compound is named, its chemistry is described, and its manufacture, supply, and possession become criminal offences. This worked reasonably well in an era when the range of psychoactive compounds in circulation was limited, and the pace of new synthesis was slow. In the early 21st century, it catastrophically did not work, because the pace of new synthesis was not slow at all. It was faster than legislation by an enormous margin. Every time a cathinone was banned, mephedrone in 2010, methylone in 2010, butylone in 2011, a new variant appeared. The analogue was slightly different. The effect was substantially similar. The legal status was, until further notice, a grey zone. And in that grey zone, commerce happened. By the time the UK government moved to the Broad-Spectrum Psychoactive Substances Act in 2016, several years of supply chain infrastructure had been built around these substances. The head shops were gone, but the distribution networks remained, having simply migrated underground. The product kept moving. The law had closed one door and the market had moved to a window. What this history reveals is not a failure of specific legislation, but a fundamental mismatch between the speed of chemical innovation and the speed of democratic governance. It takes months, sometimes years, to get a substance scheduled under most jurisdictions' drug laws. Expert review, committee consideration, parliamentary time, legal drafting. A chemist with moderate skills can produce a new analogue in weeks. The race was always going to be close. The law was always going to lose at least some of the time. And when it lost, what filled the gap was not nothing. It was the market. And the market had no interest whatsoever in what the product did to the people who used it. What the legal loophole story ultimately reveals is not a failure of intent, but a failure of architecture. The legislators who wrote the drug laws that MDPV slipped through were not indifferent to drug harm. The system they built was simply not designed for the speed of the problem it was asked to manage, and systems that are not designed for the speed of their problem do not fail dramatically. They fail incrementally, in the gaps, in the grey zones, in the 2 years between a compound appearing and a scheduling order coming into effect. Each of those years was not empty. It was full of the things that happen when something harmful is accessible, before it is illegal. The architecture mattered. It always does. It would be easy and deeply wrong to tell the story of monkey dust purely as an abstract public health crisis, as statistics and policy failures and alarming viral footage. The story is also and mostly about individual people. People who were, in many cases, already navigating lives of significant difficulty when monkey dust arrived. Former heroin users who switched because it was cheaper and initially felt more manageable. Homeless people who used it because the cold and the fear of a night on the street and the availability of a £2 hit were all happening at the same time. Young people who tried it once at a party and discovered, too late, that once wasn't a number monkey dust was interested in honouring. Among the accounts that emerged from the community workers, addiction counsellors, and harm reduction volunteers working in Stoke during this period, several consistent profiles appeared. There was the person who had been managing a heroin habit for years, stable enough, in the grim relative meaning of stable when applied to opioid addiction, who switched to monkey dust because it was dramatically cheaper and because a relative or friend had described it as safer. This turned out to be catastrophically false, but the logic of it was not irrational given what they knew. Cheaper, available, seemingly less associated with the overdose deaths they had seen. The consequences took a while to reveal themselves, by which time the neurological hooks were already in. There was the person sleeping rough, a category that, in Stoke as elsewhere, overlapped significantly with the monkey dust user population. For someone spending nights outside, the drug suppression of cold, hunger and fear was not recreational, it was functional. It allowed you to endure circumstances that would otherwise be unendurable. The fact that it was destroying the neurological infrastructure needed to eventually exit those circumstances was a long-term consideration that the short-term reality of a winter night did not leave much room for. There was the young person, often younger than the coverage suggested, who encountered the drug in a social context among friends at a time when they were already in a difficult stretch of their life. Job loss, relationship breakdown, the particular formlessness of early adulthood when the structures that were supposed to materialize, work, income, stability, have failed to appear. The drug filled the gap that those structures were supposed to occupy. Then the drug became the gap itself, which is the oldest and most reliable mechanism of addiction there is. None of these people were seeking to become a viral video. None of them were making simple, reversible choices. None of them were adequately represented by the footage or the tabloid coverage. They were people in difficult circumstances encountering a substance specifically optimized, not deliberately, not maliciously, but through pure market logic, to be accessible and powerful and very, very hard to leave behind. The trap was not set for them specifically, but they walked into it nonetheless, and the door was not designed to open from the inside. What the clinical and community accounts made abundantly clear, and what the popular framing consistently obscured, was that the path into monkey dust addiction was almost always a path that had been visible for a considerable time before the drug appeared on it. The people who became most severely trapped were almost universally people for whom multiple systems had already failed. Not one system, not a single unlucky break, but a sequence of failures in housing, in mental health care, in employment, in family support, that had progressively removed the resources a person needs to absorb the specific kind of stress that leads to the specific kind of vulnerability that a cheap and powerful drug is designed, in its blind market logic, to exploit. The drug was the last thing, not the first. One of the most disturbing features of monkey dust addiction, and clinicians who worked with users in Stoke described this with a kind of professional alarm that was itself alarming, was how quickly it established itself and how poorly it responded to existing treatment models. Heroin addiction is terrible, but there are protocols, there are medications, methadone, buprenorphine, that act on the same receptors and allow a managed reduction. MDPV targets dopamine and norepinephrine, not the opioid system. The substitution therapies that had been carefully developed over decades simply did not apply. There was no monkey dust methadone. There was no taper. There was very little between the user and the withdrawal except time, support, and the specific brutality of a brain recalibrating after having its reward system completely steamrolled. The speed with which physical and psychological dependence established itself was, according to clinical accounts, unusually rapid even by the standards of stimulant drugs. Cocaine, which shares some of MDPV's mechanism in terms of dopamine reuptake inhibition, typically requires a period of regular use before the compulsive patterns of addiction fully set in. With MDPV, the accounts suggested a much shorter timeline. People described going from first use to compulsive daily use in days or weeks rather than months. Whether this reflects the drug's particular pharmacological profile, its extreme potency, its prolonged action, or whether it reflects the specific vulnerability of the population using it, or both, is not yet fully established. The outcome was the same regardless. Stimulant addiction does not, in general, have the obvious acute withdrawal syndrome of opioids. You will not go into physical withdrawal from methamphetamine in the way that a heroin user's body physically convulses and purges when opioids are removed. But stimulant withdrawal is not comfortable. In the acute phase after stopping MDPV, users described exhaustion of an almost paralytic depth, a fatigue so profound that basic physical functions like getting out of bed or eating felt insurmountably difficult. Alongside that, depression of the specific emptiness that follows the removal of something that had been providing all available sources of pleasure. Anhedonia, the clinical term for the inability to feel pleasure from things that would normally produce it, is a consistent feature of stimulant withdrawal. After MDPV, the brain's dopamine system has been running on empty for so long that even the normal minor pleasures of existence, warmth, food, conversation, register as nothing. Treatment services in Stoke were not prepared for this, partly because their infrastructure had been built around opioid addiction, and partly because novel psychoactive substance addiction was not a category the existing treatment frameworks had adequate tools for. The staff were willing, often heroically so given their workloads. The medication options were limited. The evidence base for what worked was thin, because monkey dust had not been in clinical circulation long enough for the research to have caught up. The people most in need of help were being helped by people who were, in some significant respects, working it out as they went. That is not a criticism, it is a description of what happens when a drug outpaces the system designed to manage it. One of the most significant consequences of the absence of an established treatment protocol was not clinical but human. It left support workers without the framework of certainty that experienced clinical knowledge provides. Working with heroin addiction is not easy, but there is a body of knowledge, hard won over decades, that tells you broadly what to expect, what helps, what the trajectory looks like. With monkey dust, that knowledge did not yet exist. Workers were asked to provide support in conditions of considerable uncertainty about what the support should look like. Some of them handled this with impressive pragmatism. They did what seemed to help, watched what happened, and adjusted. Others found the uncertainty itself a significant barrier. The absence of a rule book was not just an inconvenience. It was, for some of the people trying to use it, a genuine wound. If the high of monkey dust is a freight train, the come down is the wreckage. Users describe the drop as arriving with extraordinary speed and ferocity, not a gentle decline but a sudden removal of everything the drug had provided, leaving behind exhaustion, depression, and a craving so intense it functions less like a want and more like a biological imperative. This is why the compulsive redosing pattern so consistently reported in clinical observations made sense. Users weren't chasing the high so much as trying to outrun the low. You take the second dose not because the first felt good, but because the alternative, the return to the unmedicated brain in its current depleted state, feels physically unbearable. This is the trap. You're not choosing to use again. Your nervous system has taken the controls. The redose cycle is one of the most well-documented and most misunderstood features of MDPV addiction, and it is worth dwelling on because it explains something that outside observers often struggle to understand about compulsive drug use. The point, eventually, is not pleasure. The point is the avoidance of what happens without it. This is the mechanism that distinguishes compulsive use from recreational use. The recreational user takes the drug because it makes them feel good. The compulsive user takes the drug because not taking it makes them feel unbearable. These are different motivations with different pharmacological bases, and treating them as the same thing, as simple moral failures, as choices that could simply be unmade, is one of the fundamental errors in how addiction is culturally understood. What was particularly noted by workers at the sharp end in Stoke was the speed of the cycle. MDPV's effects are intense and, relatively speaking, short-lived. The window of the high is measured in hours. The come-down arrives fast. The craving arrives immediately. So the pattern was not once a day, not even 3 or 4 times a day in the way that heroin users might manage their habit. It was compulsive and frequent. People redosing multiple times across the waking hours, and sometimes not sleeping at all for days, because sleep itself became an obstacle to the next dose. The sleep deprivation that resulted was independent of the drug's direct effects, capable of producing psychosis on its own. The combination of the two was, to put it clinically, very bad. People caught in the redose cycle described the experience of watching themselves do it and not being able to stop, a kind of internal split between the part of the self that knew this was destroying them and the part of the self that had been commandeered by the pharmacology. This is not a failure of will. The research on compulsive redosing in stimulant addiction consistently demonstrates that the executive functions, the part of the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control, long-term thinking, and the ability to weigh consequences, is one of the first casualties of heavy stimulant use. The very cognitive tools you would need to stop are among the first things the drug removes. It is, from a neuroscientific standpoint, almost admirably efficient as a trap. The redose cycle also created a particular burden for the families and communities of people using monkey dust, people who were watching, from close proximity, the specific horror of observing someone caught in a loop they could not exit. Family members described the experience of intervening, of pleading, of securing a brief period of abstinence, only to watch it collapse again within days as the craving reasserted itself. They describe the particular grief of watching someone you know well become unrecognizable, not in their face but in their behavior, in the priorities the drug had installed in place of the ones you recognized. This secondary trauma was real, documented, and largely unaddressed by the service infrastructure. The family members of people with monkey dust addiction needed support too. In most cases, they were not getting it. Stoke-on-Trent was the epicenter, but not the only point of impact. Within a year of the Stoke-centric coverage, reports were emerging from other towns across the English Midlands and the North, Wolverhampton, Telford, Derby, parts of Lancashire. The pattern was consistent. Areas with high unemployment, stretched public services, and existing drug markets where an extraordinarily cheap synthetic stimulant could slot neatly into the existing infrastructure of addiction and informal supply. It wasn't airborne. It wasn't mysterious. It moved the way cheap drugs always move, through supply networks, through social circles, through the particular gravitational pull that an inexpensive and potent substance exerts in communities where expensive options had long been the only ones. The geography of monkey dust spread is, in retrospect, almost a perfect map of post-industrial decline in England. Follow the towns where the drug established itself in the years after 2017, and you follow the towns that lost manufacturing employment in the 80s and 90s and never found an equivalent replacement. This is not a coincidence. It is a demonstration of the relationship between economic precarity and drug market penetration that public health researchers have documented consistently, and that policymakers have consistently preferred not to dwell on. Cheap drugs go where cheap things are needed. Where things are cheap because people are poor. The drug market is not indiscriminate in its geography. It is, in the most uncomfortable sense, rational. The spread was also facilitated by a particular feature of MDPV's supply chain that separated it from more traditional drug markets, because it was manufactured and shipped at the bulk chemical level, arriving as powder in quantities that were then divided and distributed locally. The barriers to entry for local distributors were low. You did not need connections to a heroin supply network, which requires established relationships with importers and the trust those relationships require. You needed to know where to order powder online and how to divide it. The network was flat, informal, and fast. By the time authorities in a new town were aware of the drug's presence, the market was already established. What the spread made visible, and what it forced into public debate in ways that the Stoke coverage alone could not, was the national scope of the infrastructure, or lack of it, that existed to respond to novel drug crises. Each local authority was dealing with a new problem using tools designed for old problems. Each NHS trust was encountering MDPV presentations without shared protocols or evidence-based treatment guides. The knowledge being developed, hard-won, experientially derived, genuinely valuable, in Stoke, was not being systematically transferred to the towns experiencing their own emerging crises. Everyone was starting from scratch. In a national health system, that is an expensive and avoidable failure. The spread of monkey dust beyond Stoke also had implications for what might be called the institutional memory of the crisis. Stoke services, imperfect, underfunded, overwhelmed, had at least accumulated some knowledge about the drug and how to manage its consequences. The towns where it subsequently appeared were starting from the beginning. The public health value of what had been learned in Stoke, about what presentations looked like, what helped, what escalated situations, what harm reduction approaches reduced emergency attendances, was not being systematically shared. There was no national rapid response public health infrastructure for novel drug crises of this kind. There was no mechanism for turning the hard experience of one city into the starting point for the next. Every new outbreak was, in institutional terms, the first one. That repetition was expensive in the most direct sense. It cost people their lives. The coverage of monkey dust in the British press was enormous, largely sensationalist, occasionally useful, and almost entirely focused on the most dramatic visual elements of the crisis. The zombie footage, the strength, the climbing. What it generally failed to do was ask the harder question, which was not what is this drug doing to people, but what conditions made this drug inevitable. The framing of the users as inexplicable, frightening, almost subhuman, the zombie language, the monster language, served to distance the audience from the reality, which was that these were people in one of the most economically deprived cities in England, using the cheapest available option in a market that existed because better options were unavailable or unaffordable. That's a harder story to tell with B-roll of someone climbing a fence. But it's the real one. The zombie framing did specific damage that went beyond poor journalism. When you describe a group of people as zombies, you are, whether deliberately or not, removing them from the category of people whose suffering demands a response. Zombies do not suffer. Zombies do not have families, histories, or circumstances that explain how they came to be where they are. Zombies are simply a threat to be managed and contained, or, in the more literal cultural meaning of the word, destroyed. The language shaped the response. It encouraged a policing model rather than a public health model. It generated outrage and disgust rather than the more difficult and useful emotions of empathy and structural analysis. The most revealing thing about the coverage was what it chose to leave out. Almost none of it discussed austerity. Almost none of it discussed the reduction in addiction services. Almost none of it discussed the destruction of the employment base in the towns most affected. Almost none of it asked why a substance this cheap and this powerful had found such ready customers in such specific places. These were available questions. They were not invisible or obscure. They were simply questions whose answers pointed towards systemic failures, rather than individual moral failings, and systemic failures are, generally speaking, a harder sell than footage of someone climbing a sign. There were exceptions. Some journalists, particularly those embedded in the local press who knew Stoke and knew its people, produced reporting that was humane, contextualised, and honest about both the drug's effects and the conditions that had made it possible. These pieces were important. They were also far less widely shared than the footage, because the footage was extraordinary and context is not. Context requires patience. Context requires you to sit with discomfort rather than letting the spectacle carry you past it. Context asks you to consider whether the person you're watching climb a fence might, in different circumstances, have been you. That is not a comfortable ask. It rarely trends. The coverage also failed in a more basic way that is worth naming. It was overwhelmingly produced by people who did not live in Stoke, did not know Stoke, and did not particularly intend to. The national media arrived, filmed, filed, and left. The local media, who understood the context, knew the history, had relationships with the communities being described, produced better work consistently, but with a fraction of the reach. There is a structural problem in British journalism in which the places most urgently requiring sustained public attention are precisely the places most likely to have seen their local news infrastructure decimated by the economics of the media industry. Stoke had fewer journalists covering it, with fewer resources than it had had a decade earlier. The national journalists who parachuted in for the peak of the crisis did not compensate for that loss. They produced a different kind of story about a different kind of Stoke, more lurid, less true. You cannot tell the story of monkey dust without at least a glance westward, because the United States had its own synthetic cathinone panic several years earlier, and it was, if anything, even more baroque. Beginning around 2010 and reaching peak media hysteria by 2012, American bath salts, a loose term covering several cathinones including MDPHP, generated a wave of coverage remarkable for its combination of genuine alarm and spectacular overreach. The so-called Miami zombie incident of 2012, in which a man attacked another person in a manner attributed to bath salts, turned out to involve no bath salts at all. The toxicology showed only marijuana. The narrative, however, had already left the building, and no correction caught up to it. The American bath salts panic contains a cautionary tale about media and drug scares that is worth unpacking even years after the fact. The actual harms of synthetic cathinones in the United States were real and documented. Emergency room presentations, cardiac events, acute psychosis, deaths. These were serious enough to warrant serious attention, but the coverage that emerged was not serious attention. It was amplified by the Miami zombie story, which was, again, factually wrong in its central premise into something that generated the particular heat of moral panic rather than the cooler light of public health analysis. Moral panics about drugs are not new in American history. You can trace a direct line from the reefer madness panics of the 1930s, through the crack cocaine hysteria of the 1980s, to the bath salts frenzy of 2012. Each panic had some basis in real harm. Each was substantially amplified beyond the evidence. Each generated policy responses that were more concerned with appearing decisive than with being effective. Each also, by inflating the horror of the threat, made it harder to have sensible conversations about harm reduction, treatment, and the structural conditions that drove drug use in the first place. The American experience with bath salts is instructive for the monkey dust story in one additional sense. It demonstrates what happens when a drug panic subsides without the underlying conditions being addressed. Bath salts did not disappear. The cathinone market did not end. It diversified, mutated, and moved to different compounds, different packaging, different names. The legislative responses scheduled specific substances which prompted the development of new ones. The same cycle that had played out with mephedrone in the UK played out with bath salts in the US. And in both cases, the drugs that followed were not obviously less dangerous. They were simply less covered by the specific laws that had been written about their predecessors. The American bath salts panic also produced as its aftermath something instructive. A significant body of research conducted in the years following the peak of the crisis that substantially revised the more extreme claims that had been made. Studies on MDPV specifically showed that while its potential for harm was genuine and serious, the scope and mechanism of that harm were more precisely defined than the initial coverage suggested. This research mattered, not because it diminished the seriousness of the drug, but because accurate understanding of what a substance does and does not do is a precondition for effective policy and treatment. The lesson, for the UK context of monkey dust, was both that the harm was real and that the narrative about the harm needed to be kept tethered to the evidence, something the zombie framing actively resisted. The Miami zombie had never used bath salts. The people in the Stoke footage really had. That distinction mattered. Getting it right was the only way the response could be proportionate. The story of synthetic cathinones actually begins with a leaf, a real ancient leaf with a long and legitimate history. Khat, the plant from which cathinones take their name, has been cultivated and consumed in Yemen, Ethiopia, Somalia, and across the Horn of Africa for at least 1,000 years. It is chewed slowly over several hours. The active compound, cathinone, releases gradually, producing mild stimulation, talkativeness, and a gentle euphoria. It is, in the context in which it was developed, a social drug, used in community gatherings, associated with hospitality and conversation, consumed in ways that naturally limit the intensity of the effect. The synthetic versions took that gentle cathinone structure and, through a series of chemical modifications, turned it into something that its original plant could not have recognized. There is something almost poignant about this lineage. The khat plant has a cultural context that contains its own use. It is chewed slowly, in company over hours. The dose rate is limited by the physical process of chewing, and by the social norms around its use, and by the mildness of the compound relative to what the synthetic versions would become. This is a pattern seen elsewhere in drug history. Natural psychoactive substances that exist within cultural frameworks that mitigate their harm, and synthetic modifications that remove both the natural limit on dose and the cultural context around use. What remains is just the pharmacology, uncontained and uncontextualized, in a community that has no generational knowledge of how to manage it. Cathinone was first isolated from the sat plant by researchers in the 1970s. It was identified as the primary psychoactive compound and subsequently scheduled as a controlled substance in many countries. This scheduling, ironically, prompted research into cathinone analogues, synthetic versions that were, at the time of research, technically unscheduled. MDPV was one result of this research. It was synthesized in the 1960s, appeared in the pharmacological literature as a compound with potential, subsequently abandoned, for treating chronic fatigue. It sat dormant in the literature for decades. Then someone found it, recognized its properties, and introduced it to the recreational drug market. This is a trajectory that would be almost comical if it were not also a tragedy. A compound derived from a millennium-old cultural practice of gentle socializing, modified in a laboratory, identified in a medical context as a potential fatigue treatment, shelved, rediscovered by the illicit market, and eventually deployed on the streets of a post-industrial English city for £2 a bag. The cat bush growing on a Yemeni hillside and the person collapsed on a pavement in Stoke have a direct chemical lineage. That lineage was not inevitable. It was a series of choices, scientific, commercial, regulatory, economic, each of which made the next step possible. The leaf did not do this. People did. There is a question that runs underneath the cat connection and is rarely asked directly. What does it mean that a plant with 1,000 years of cultural history as a mild, social, relatively harmless substance was the pharmacological starting point for something that destroyed communities? The answer involves chemistry, obviously. The cathinone in CART is not MDPV, and the distance between them is real and significant. But it also involves something about the conditions under which substances move from their cultural context into new ones. The kate leaf was held in place, partly by the community practices around it. When the active compound was extracted, synthesized, amplified, and transplanted into a different context, one with no traditional knowledge, no community norms, no accumulated wisdom about how to manage it, the cultural container was gone, and only the pharmacology remained. This is not unique to cat. It is a general principle about the relationship between drugs and the context in which they are used. Remove the context, and the harm scales. The physical consequences of monkey dust use, beyond the immediate psychosis and the extraordinary strength, were, over time, documented with a particular clinical bleakness that medical literature reserves for genuinely bad outcomes. Hypothermia, the body temperature rising to dangerous levels because the stimulant response is pushing physiological systems to the edge of their tolerance. Rhabdomyolysis, the breakdown of muscle tissue from extreme physical exertion during psychotic episodes, releasing proteins into the bloodstream that can cause kidney failure, cardiac arrhythmias, stroke, seizure, and then the longer-term neurological effects in people who survived repeated heavy use, cognitive impairment, persistent paranoia, difficulty with memory and concentration, the brain's delicate chemical infrastructure disrupted in ways that did not simply repair themselves when the drug was removed. Hypothermia is worth particular attention because it represents one of the most acutely dangerous aspects of MDPV intoxication and one of the most mismanaged from a bystander perspective. A person in stimulant-induced hypothermia looks, externally, like they may be running very hot, sweating, flushed, agitated. What is happening internally is a body temperature that can climb to levels capable of causing organ failure and brain damage, and it can climb there quickly. The physiological drivers are the same ones that make the drug feel powerful. The norepinephrine surge that pushes the body systems to maximum activation also generates enormous amounts of heat. If that heat cannot be dissipated, which is difficult when the person is agitated, moving, not drinking water, in a warm environment, the core temperature climbs to ranges that are genuinely life-threatening. Rhabdomyolysis is a consequence that most people outside medicine have never heard of, and that is, even with that ignorance, not a comfortable thing to learn about. The extreme muscle activity during MDPV psychosis, the climbing, the struggling, the extended physical agitation can cause muscle fibers to break down and release myoglobin, a protein, into the bloodstream. The kidneys, attempting to filter this protein from the blood, can be overwhelmed by the volume. The result is acute kidney injury. People have required dialysis. People have required transplants. People have died of kidney failure following MDPV intoxication without any cardiac event, without any overdose in the traditional sense. Their bodies simply destroyed themselves from the inside, doing the thing the drug told them to do. The cardiac consequences were perhaps the most feared and the least predictable. MDPV's action on norepinephrine puts the cardiovascular system under significant stress. Elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, potential for arrhythmia. In people with pre-existing cardiac conditions, or in people who'd been using heavily and were dehydrated and thermally stressed, cardiac events occurred. The mechanism was not obscure. It was the same mechanism by which cocaine causes cardiac arrest in young, apparently healthy people. Extreme autonomic overstimulation of a system not designed to sustain that level of activation for extended periods. The drug was not making an error. It was doing exactly what it was pharmacologically designed to do, in a body that was not built to survive the consequences. What made the physiological consequences of monkey dust distinctive in the emergency context was not simply their severity. Other drugs produce severe physiological consequences, but their unpredictability. The dose-response relationship for MDPV was, in street-level use, effectively unmanageable. Street powder of unknown purity, taken by people with unknown prior use history, unknown concurrent substance use, and unknown underlying health conditions, produced outcomes that range from apparently manageable intoxication to cardiac arrest within the same rough dose range. Clinicians could not triage by assuming that a person who appeared stable would remain stable. The trajectory of an MDPV presentation could turn quickly and without obvious warning. This meant that every presentation required high-level clinical attention that the services were not resourced to provide consistently. The physiology was not just severe, it was expensive in the most direct clinical and financial sense. Nurses and doctors working in the emergency departments and psychiatric units of hospitals serving Stoke and surrounding areas during the height of the crisis were dealing with presentations they had no clean category for. A patient in acute monkey dust psychosis was not straightforwardly a psychiatric patient, not straightforwardly an overdose, not straightforwardly anything the triage system had been designed to handle. Sedation was unreliable. Standard antipsychotics had limited and inconsistent effects. The paranoia and agitation could persist for hours, sometimes days after the last dose. A withdrawal profile that was both unpredictable and extremely resource-intensive to manage. One nurse, speaking to a local journalist, described it as like trying to treat something we'd never seen before because we hadn't. The problem of sedation in MDPV-intoxicated patients was, by multiple accounts, significant. Standard benzodiazepines, the class of medications most commonly used to calm acute agitation in emergency settings, had effects that were blunted, delayed, or insufficient in people presenting on monkey dust. The pharmacological explanation involves the interaction between a drug that is driving the norepinephrine and dopamine systems to maximum activation and medications designed for a nervous system operating at more normal parameters. Higher doses were sometimes required. Those higher doses carried their own risks. The clinical team was making judgment calls without an evidence base to guide them, because the evidence base didn't exist yet. The psychiatric ward presentations were, if anything, more challenging than the acute emergency presentations. A patient brought in during an acute episode might stabilise to a degree over the first hours or days, but what followed was not a clean return to baseline. The psychosis, the paranoia, the disorganised thinking, the persistent belief that threats were present when they were not, could continue at reduced intensity but still clinically significant levels for days after the drug was cleared from the system. In some cases, weeks. In a small number of documented cases, the symptoms became chronic. Whether this represented the drug triggering or unmasking a pre-existing psychotic vulnerability, or whether it represented direct neurological damage from MDPV itself, was a question the clinical teams were in no position to definitively answer. The ward staff described the strain of managing patients who were simultaneously acutely ill, potentially dangerous to themselves and others, bewildered about their own condition, and, in the intervals of relative clarity, devastated. The glimpses of the person underneath the acute presentation, frightened, ashamed, often asking for specific family members, sometimes weeping without being entirely sure why, were, according to multiple accounts, among the most difficult aspects of the clinical experience. You could see who was in there. You just couldn't reach them for long enough to help them find their way back. The thing that perhaps most clearly illustrated the inadequacy of the clinical infrastructure, and that was most frequently mentioned by ward staff in the accounts that emerged from this period, was the discharge problem. A patient stabilised in the acute phase of monkey dust psychosis was, at some point, discharged. Discharged to what? In the majority of cases, to the same circumstances that had preceded their admission. The same housing situation, or lack of it. The same absence of support. The same proximity to the supply. The same fundamental conditions that had made the drug an option in the first place. Stabilising someone in a hospital bed and then returning them unchanged to an unchanged environment was not treatment. It was a pause. And the pause, however valuable in the immediate clinical sense, was not a solution. The revolving door spun. One of the most consistent and least discussed aspects of the monkey dust crisis was the overlap with homelessness. In Stoke, as in other affected towns, a significant proportion of the heaviest users were people without stable housing. People sleeping rough, in temporary accommodation, in the informal networks of sofas and hostels that constitute survival when the formal safety net has failed to catch you. Monkey dust was, in this context, not simply a drug. It was a tool for enduring circumstances that would otherwise be unendurable. The cold, the fear, the specific grinding exhaustion of a life in constant material precarity. It suppressed the need for sleep and food, both of which were in short supply. It produced temporarily feelings of confidence and energy in people whose circumstances gave them very little to feel confident or energetic about. The fact that it also destroyed them, slowly and sometimes quickly, was the bill that came later. To understand why a stimulant with MDPV's profile would be appealing to someone sleeping rough requires sitting briefly in the situation. A winter night outside in an English city is not simply cold. It is cold in a way that is physically dangerous, that carries the threat of hypothermia, that makes sleep difficult and sometimes impossible. The fear of being attacked while sleeping, a real and documented hazard for rough sleepers, adds another layer of arousal that prevents rest. The exhaustion and depression of long-term homelessness are chronic and severe. Into this situation, a drug arrives that eliminates the need for sleep, suppresses hunger so that the absence of food is less distressing, and generates a temporary but powerful experience of confidence and capability. The logic of using it is not irrational. It is a response to conditions that demand a response. The drug is a terrible response, but it is a response. The relationship between homelessness and monkey dust was also, from a public health perspective, a profound complicating factor in treatment. The evidence consistently shows that addiction treatment is most effective when the person in treatment has stable housing. The stability of housing provides the basic safety that allows the much harder work of psychological recovery to begin. Without it, every aspect of the treatment challenge is amplified. You cannot do the cognitive and emotional work of changing entrenched patterns of behavior when your primary cognitive resources are directed toward keeping yourself alive. The homelessness and the addiction were not separable problems requiring separate interventions. They were the same problem, and neither could be adequately addressed without addressing the other. Crisis services in Stoke were dealing with this interconnection at street level, every day, without the resources to do either half of the job adequately. The drug support workers were trying to engage people who had nowhere to go to be stable. The housing workers were trying to find appropriate accommodation for people whose acute drug use made them ineligible for most available options. The two halves of the problem were passing each other in the doorways of underfunded services, and the people at the centre of both were falling through. The response to the homelessness monkey dust overlap that did exist, and it was patchy, underfunded and inconsistent, tended to involve individuals and small organisations rather than systemic interventions. Street outreach workers who knew names, knew sleeping spots, knew who had been using and for how long. Harm reduction workers carrying information rather than condemnation. The occasional intervention that, because it happened at the right moment with the right person, opened a door that might otherwise have remained closed. These interventions were real, and they saved lives, and they were radically insufficient to the scale of the need. The gap between what was possible with proper resourcing and what was actually available was not subtle. It was the gap between a crisis managed and a crisis weathered. The UK has a National Health Service that is, in principle, the envy of much of the world. It also has an addiction treatment infrastructure that had been cut by nearly half between 2010 and 2018, a period of austerity that corresponded almost exactly with the rise of novel psychoactive substances. The clinics that might have provided support, the community workers who might have identified at-risk individuals, the inpatient beds that might have allowed medically supervised withdrawal, all of these had been systematically reduced in the years before monkey dust appeared. When the crisis arrived, the infrastructure needed to respond to it had already been significantly dismantled. This is not a conspiracy. It is a policy consequence of a very particular and painful kind. The numbers are not subtle. England's addiction treatment budget was cut by approximately 40% in real terms between 2010 and 2017. This is not a contested figure. It is documented by Public Health England, by the National Audit Office, by the organisations representing treatment providers. The number of people in treatment dropped substantially over the same period. The number of drug-related deaths climbed substantially over the same period. These two trends are not coincidentally related. They are causally related in the direction the simple logic suggests. Fewer treatment places, fewer people in treatment, more people dying. The mechanism is not complicated. The willingness to see it is where the complexity lies. Into this contracted treatment landscape arrived monkey dust, a substance with no established treatment protocol, a user group with complex and overlapping needs, and a pharmacological profile that the existing medication toolkit was not designed to address. The people in front of the treatment workers were not straightforward cases. They were often dual diagnosis, addiction, alongside significant mental health conditions, each exacerbating the other. They were often multiplied disadvantaged, homeless or precariously housed, unemployed, socially isolated. They required not just a treatment intervention, but a sustained, multimodal, properly resourced program of support across several domains simultaneously. What was available in many cases was a 45-minute appointment every few weeks. The ambition of the clinical staff frequently and visibly exceeded the resources they had been given to work with. The treatment gap was not invisible to the people experiencing it. People seeking help described being told waiting lists, told there were no available beds, told that the service they needed didn't exist in their area, told to come back next week. Some came back, some didn't. The people who didn't come back did not disappear. They remained in the community, in deteriorating condition, generating calls to emergency services that cost more per incident than a treatment program costs per year. The economics of underfunding addiction treatment are clear and have been clearly articulated many times. The political calculation that produced the underfunding persisted anyway. The cruelest aspect of the treatment gap was its visibility. It was not a hidden failure, not a problem that required investigative journalism or a freedom of information request to identify. The people working within the system described it openly, consistently, and with a specificity that left no room for ambiguity about what was needed and what was absent. The organisations representing treatment providers published reports. The professional bodies raised the alarm. The statistics on drug-related deaths were published annually, showing the same upward trajectory year after year. The information was available. What was not available was the political will to act on it, at the scale it demanded, a will that required, among other things, a willingness to say out loud that the people dying of drug-related causes in English cities were not the authors of their own destruction, and that the system that had failed them bore a share of the responsibility. That sentence, in certain political contexts, remained unsayable. By the height of the Stoke crisis, it had become apparent that frontline police officers were functioning as something they had not been trained to be: impromptu mental health responders and social workers for people in acute drug-induced psychosis. The gap between what was needed and what was available was being filled, by default, by the people who showed up when someone called 999. Officers were managing long-term contact with people in active addiction, making welfare checks on people they had come to know by name, navigating the intersection of a criminal justice system and a health crisis with inadequate tools for either. Several officers gave interviews describing the toll of this work, the frustration, the compassion fatigue, and the fundamental absurdity of arresting people who were clearly visibly catastrophically unwell. The absurdity was structural and not the fault of the individual officers involved, many of whom were, by multiple accounts, showing extraordinary patience and care in circumstances that did not invite either. An officer attending a monkey dust call faced a situation with no good options. The person in front of them was in acute medical distress and required clinical care. But the clinical pathway was not available. Insufficient beds, insufficient staff, a mental health crisis service stretched beyond its capacity. The criminal justice pathway, arrest, detention, charge, was inappropriate and counterproductive for someone in a medical emergency, but it was the pathway the system had equipped them to use. Between the medical system that should have been the answer and the criminal system that was the only available mechanism, the officer stood and improvised. Over time, some officers developed expertise in managing MDPV-related incidents that was genuinely remarkable. Clinical knowledge acquired not through training but through repetition, through conversations with ambulance crews, through asking questions and paying attention. The same individuals would be called to the same people, week after week. They knew names, they knew histories, they knew which interventions tended to help and which tended to escalate. They knew which family members could be reached and which could not. This knowledge was entirely informally held, not recorded in any system, not transferable when the officer went off shift. It was, in an institutional sense, invisible, and that invisibility was both a waste and a risk. The psychological cost to officers was not invisible. Post-traumatic stress disorder rates in policing are significantly elevated compared to the general population, and the particular stresses of repeatedly attending to people in acute human suffering without the clinical framework that medical professionals have for processing those experiences is one of the contributing factors. Officers are trained to manage threat and maintain order. They're not trained to sit with the specific grief of watching the same person deteriorate over months, of attending to the same individual in crisis for the 15th time, knowing that there is no mechanism available that will change the outcome. Some did it anyway, with quiet professionalism that the broader narrative about law enforcement and drug use did not often make space to acknowledge. What the police's mental health responder problem ultimately pointed toward was a gap in the public service architecture that went well beyond drug policy. The question of who responds when someone is in crisis, medical crisis, psychiatric crisis, social crisis, and what resources they bring with them is a question with enormous consequences for outcomes. Police are trained for one kind of response. Medical professionals are trained for another. Social workers for another. When someone presents in acute monkey dust psychosis, they need elements of all three simultaneously. The architecture of response was not built for that simultaneity. It was built on the assumption that the categories were distinct, that a medical problem would present as a medical problem, and a criminal justice problem would present as a criminal justice problem. The reality, as anyone who worked in Stoke in 2018 could tell you, was substantially more complicated. Part of what made monkey dust so devastatingly inexpensive was the relatively straightforward nature of its synthesis compared to traditional controlled drugs. Cocaine requires a specific plant grown in specific conditions in specific countries, followed by an elaborate extraction and processing chain, followed by international smuggling networks, followed by cutting and distribution. Monkey dust required a chemical order, a moderately equipped laboratory, and access to shipping. The precursor chemicals were, for a period, openly available from legitimate industrial chemical suppliers. The equipment needed was modest. The expertise required was, in the global context of clandestine drug production, not exceptional. This is the structural advantage of the synthetic drug market. It is not dependent on geography, agriculture, or the vulnerabilities of long supply chains. It can be made anywhere. To understand the cost economics, consider what is involved in the production of heroin. You need poppy fields, which require climate, land, labour, and the cooperation, willing or coerced, of the communities where they grow. You need processing facilities which require chemical inputs, equipment, and security from both rival groups and law enforcement. You need transportation networks capable of moving the product from production areas in Afghanistan or Myanmar through multiple countries to the ultimate consumer markets in Western Europe or North America. Every link in that chain has cost, risk, and someone taking a margin. By the time the product reaches the street, it has been through 6 or 8 layers of economic activity, each of which has added to its price. This is why heroin is expensive relative to the cost of producing the raw material. The synthetic drug supply chain compresses all of this. The raw material is not a plant but a precursor chemical that can be ordered through commercial channels. The processing is synthetic rather than agricultural, requiring equipment but not land, and not the cooperation of farming communities in geopolitically complex regions. The product is shipped directly from the point of synthesis to the distribution point, often via postal and courier services that are difficult to intercept at scale. The margins at each stage are real, but the number of stages is dramatically reduced. The result is a production cost per dose that is orders of magnitude lower than any traditional drug. This economic advantage is not temporary or circumstantial. It is structural. As long as novel psychoactive substances can be synthesized from commercially available precursors, as long as the synthesis does not require exotic equipment or rare expertise, and as long as international shipping remains a practical distribution mechanism, the synthetic drug market will continue to undercut traditional markets on price. The £2 bag of monkey dust was not a promotional offer. It was the natural equilibrium price of a product made in this way, at this scale, for this market. And it will keep finding new names and new formulations until something more fundamental than a scheduling decision changes the conditions that make it rational to produce. The cheap chemistry of monkey dust also had implications that extended beyond pricing. Because the barrier to entry in the supply chain was relatively low, the market was competitive and fragmented in ways that traditional drug markets, with their established hierarchies and significant capital requirements, are not. More suppliers meant more variability in product quality and purity. More variability and purity meant more unpredictable dose responses. More unpredictable dose responses meant more acute clinical presentations. The economics of cheap synthesis did not just produce a cheap drug. They produced an inconsistent drug in a way that made its harms harder to manage and harder to predict. The very features of the supply chain that made monkey dust accessible were the same features that made it dangerous in ways that went beyond the intrinsic pharmacology of the compound itself. The bulk of the novel psychoactive substances that flooded European and American markets in the 2010s were synthesized in China, a country with a large, sophisticated chemical manufacturing industry, relatively limited regulation of novel compounds for a significant period, and an extraordinary volume of global shipping infrastructure. This is not a simple story of Chinese criminality. Many of the laboratories producing these compounds were operating legally under Chinese law at the time of production. The substances were not controlled in China. They were shipped through legitimate freight channels. The legal problems began when they crossed into countries where they had been scheduled, or, more often, hadn't been yet. The global cat and mouse of drug scheduling played out for years against this backdrop of perfectly legal manufacturing and perfectly legal export. China has taken significant steps since the mid-2010s to address its role in the global novel psychoactive substance supply chain. A series of scheduling actions between 2015 and 2020 added hundreds of synthetic compounds to China's controlled substance list. International pressure, particularly from the United States, which had been particularly vocal about the role of Chinese manufacturers in the fentanyl and synthetic opioid crisis, contributed to a political environment in which regulatory action became more politically viable. These changes were real and had measurable effects on the supply of some compounds, but the response was reactive rather than preventive, following the same logic as every other attempt to regulate synthetic drug markets through scheduling. Name the thing, ban the thing, wait for the next thing. The manufacturers had the same structural advantage they had always had: the ability to modify a compound faster than a regulatory process can respond to it. And as Chinese regulatory pressure increased, production shifted to other jurisdictions, to India, to Eastern Europe, to wherever the combination of chemical manufacturing capacity, regulatory tolerance, and shipping infrastructure made synthesis viable. The supply chain was not disrupted, it relocated. The international dimension of the monkey dust problem is worth sitting with, because it highlights something about the geography of responsibility that is usually obscured. The harm was concentrated in specific, visible, geographically limited communities in England. The production was distributed across a global chemical manufacturing network. The profit was dispersed through supply chains that were, at multiple points, technically legal. Connecting those three things, the harm, the production, the legal structure that made it possible, into a coherent account of responsibility, was something that neither journalism nor policy adequately managed. It was easier to photograph the consequences than to follow the supply chain to its origin and ask who was accountable for what. The global supply chain story is also, ultimately, a story about the limits of national policy responses to transnational problems. Every scheduling decision made by the UK government, every arrest of a local dealer, every public health campaign targeted at users in Stoke had approximately zero effect on the economics of synthesis in a facility on another continent. The demand side and the supply side of this crisis were separated by thousands of miles, multiple jurisdictions, and a freight infrastructure that processed billions of packages annually. Addressing one end while leaving the other untouched was not a strategy. It was a performance of strategy. The performance had political value. It had limited public health value. The packages kept coming. The global supply chain also raises a question about the future that the present does not answer. Synthetic drug chemistry does not stand still. The compounds that replace the ones currently scheduled will be more potent, less understood, and more difficult to detect. The infrastructure that made monkey dust possible is not a temporary aberration. It is a permanent feature of the global chemical economy, one that will continue to produce new products for as long as there are communities vulnerable enough to need them and poor enough to afford nothing else. The supply side of this problem will not be addressed by supply-side solutions alone. That leaves the demand side. And the demand side is, at its root, a question about what kind of world produces people for whom 2 pounds of white powder is the most rational available choice. Recovery from monkey dust addiction was possible. Clinicians and caseworkers were careful to say this, and the evidence supported it, but they were equally careful not to make it sound easy. The people who managed to get clean shared several features: access to stable housing, which removed the environmental conditions that made the drug necessary in the first place, sustained and consistent support from addiction workers, often over periods of many months, and the particular kind of human relationship, consistent, non-judgmental, present, that turns out to be one of the most effective therapeutic tools available. Medication helped in some cases. Time helped in all of them. The brain does recover, the dopamine system does recalibrate, but the window between the acute crisis and that recovery was long, difficult, and full of the very conditions, isolation, poverty, despair, that had opened the door to the drug in the first place. The stories of recovery that emerged from Stoke and surrounding areas were not simple or linear, and the accounts of the people who told them were important precisely because they resisted the tidy narrative arc that public interest stories tend to require. There was rarely a single turning point. There was rarely a clear moment of decision. I will stop. I will change. I will be different. What there was, in most accounts, was a gradual accumulation of small things. A support worker who kept showing up, a family member who didn't give up, a moment of sufficient stability to allow a different thought to form, a bed to sleep in, a reason to come back the next day. These are not dramatic. They do not make compelling footage. They were in many cases the entirety of what recovery looked like. The brain's capacity to recover from stimulant damage is genuine and documented. The dopamine system, having been severely depleted, can rebuild its receptor density over time. The cognitive deficits, the memory problems, the difficulty concentrating, the impaired executive function tend to improve with sustained abstinence, though the timeline is long and the improvement is rarely complete in the first year. The paranoia diminishes. The anhedonia lifts gradually, as the brain learns again to register the small pleasures of existence as pleasures rather than as the grey nothing of the immediate post-use period. This recovery is real. It requires time and stability and support, which is to say, it requires exactly the things that were in shortest supply in the communities most affected by the drug. The people who recovered and who were willing to talk about it, described the experience of being on the other side as both straightforward and strange. Straightforward because the basic facts of being better were unambiguous. You knew when you could feel things again, when you could sleep normally, when the paranoia stopped. Strange because the period of use had often been so consuming that the life before it felt remote, and the shape of the life after it was yet to be invented. Recovery from addiction is never just the removal of a substance. It is the construction of an alternative, and that construction requires materials, relationships, purpose, income, place, that the communities most affected had been watching disappear for a generation. To recover from monkey dust in Stoke was to recover into a city that was itself still in recovery. Recovery is not a destination. It is a practice, and the conditions that make that practice possible or impossible are not internal to the individual. They are external: housing, support, income, community, the presence of something to recover into. The people who got through were the people who had those things, or who found them, or who had someone in their corner persistent enough to help them find them. The people who didn't make it were not weaker or less determined. They were, in most cases, simply more alone. That distinction matters enormously, and was not sufficiently reflected in either the coverage of the crisis or the policy response to it. Monkey dust did not exist in isolation. It was one branch of a sprawling synthetic drug family that had been quietly reshaping patterns of addiction across the UK and Europe for more than a decade. Mephedrone, known as Meow Meow or MCAT, had preceded it, beloved in early 2010's club culture before deaths, and tabloid panic led to its banning in 2010. Synthetic cannabinoids, marketed under names like Spice and Black Mamba, had carved out their own devastating niche, particularly among the homeless population and in prisons. Each drug followed a similar arc: emergence, brief period of legal ambiguity, media panic, legislative response, chemical shuffle, new variant. Monkey dust was not an aberration in this landscape. It was the latest iteration of a pattern that nobody had found a systemic answer to. Mephedrone is worth a moment because its trajectory contains a compressed version of almost everything that would later happen with monkey dust, played out slightly earlier and in a different demographic. Mephedrone emerged around 28 and spread rapidly through the nightclub and festival circuit. A drug that mimicked the effects of MDMA and cocaine, was cheaper than either, and for a period was entirely legal. The media response was enormous, amplified by several deaths that were attributed to mephedrone, some of which later turned out to involve other substances. The legislation came in 2010. The impact on use was real but limited. Surveys showed a drop in mephedrone use following the ban, but a corresponding rise in other synthetic cathinone use as the market substituted one compound for another. Spice and Black Mamba, the synthetic cannabinoid category, represent a different strand of the synthetic drug story, but one with significant overlap in terms of affected populations. Synthetic cannabinoids were designed to mimic the effects of cannabis by acting on the same receptors, but with a potency that natural cannabis does not approach. They became particularly prevalent in prisons, where they are more difficult to detect than cannabis, and among rough sleepers and people in precarious housing, populations that also featured prominently in the monkey dust crisis. The crossover between spice users and monkey dust users was noted by workers in the field. The same communities, the same vulnerability factors, the same pattern of a cheap synthetic stimulant finding the people with the fewest alternatives. The family tree of synthetic drugs does not have a root that can simply be cut. Every regulatory action pruned a branch and encouraged two more to grow. The underlying conditions, the demand, the poverty, the inadequate treatment infrastructure, the global chemical supply chain were not addressed by scheduling. They were not addressed by criminalisation. They were addressed to the extent that they were addressed at all, only by the slow and unfashionable work of housing people, treating people, supporting people, and changing the conditions that made the drugs necessary. That work happened in pockets, done by people who were largely unfilmed and unreported. It was less interesting than the footage. It was more important than anything else. The synthetic drug family tree also teaches something about the limitations of category-based thinking in drug policy. Mephedrone was a cathinone, spice was a cannabinoid, MDPV was a cathinone. Future compounds will be whatever the chemistry permits and the market demands. Treating each category as a separate problem requiring separate expertise, separate regulation, separate treatment approaches meant that the systemic lesson, that cheap synthetic drugs find vulnerable populations and that the vulnerability is the primary variable, was never adequately learned. The categories changed. The underlying mechanism didn't. The people who suffered for that failure of institutional learning were not the ones designing the policy. The question of what happened to Stoke-on-Trent after the peak of the monkey dust crisis is both a local story and a national lesson. The crisis did not end with a dramatic intervention. There was no single policy, no single treatment breakthrough, no moment at which the city declared victory and the problem went away. What happened was slower and less legible. Incremental improvements in treatment access, community-level harm reduction initiatives, individual recovery stories accumulating quietly alongside individual tragedies. Stoke remained Stoke, a city with deep structural challenges that predated the drug and would outlast it. The monkey dust crisis had illuminated those challenges with painful clarity. What the city did with that clarity over time was the more complicated and less cinematic part of the story. The national media attention that descended on Stoke in 2018 did bring some practical benefits, imperfect and delayed as they were. Funding conversations that had been stuck in local authority budget processes were moved to a different register when the city was visibly on the national news. Additional resource was directed, with varying degrees of speed and adequacy, toward drug treatment services and homeless provision. Partnerships between police, health services, and community organisations that had been hampered by funding competition were in some cases catalysed by the shared recognition that the scale of the problem demanded collaboration. None of this was sufficient. Some of it helped. The community response, less visible than the policy response but arguably more significant, was quietly remarkable. Community workers, peer support volunteers, family members, local charities, and individuals who had been through their own experiences with addiction formed informal networks of support that operated on the street level, in the gaps between statutory services. People who had recovered from monkey dust addiction, working alongside those currently in its grip. Harm reduction information shared in the places where people actually were, rather than in the offices where services were formally located. The resilience of communities under catastrophic stress is always, in retrospect, more organised and more effective than the coverage suggests. Stoke was no different. The people who never made the footage kept things moving. What Stoke represents in the broader story of synthetic drugs in Britain is a city that was used as both a laboratory for the effects of cheap, novel psychoactive substances on a vulnerable population and as a convenient symbol for everything that policy wanted to be seen to be addressing. The attention came and largely went. The underlying conditions did not resolve themselves in the period of immediate interest and did not resolve themselves after it. The people who remained, and the workers who continued to show up for them, were doing work that deserved far more sustained attention than a viral video cycle provides. Stoke is still there, the work is still ongoing. Stoke's story since the peak of the monkey dust crisis has been, in many ways, a story of ordinary life resuming around an extraordinary event. The schools kept running, the shops kept opening, the city kept doing what cities do in the absence of the attention that briefly made it a national symbol. The people who were most affected by the crisis did not disappear when the cameras did. They remained, some recovering, some not, some in circumstances that had changed, and some in circumstances that had not. The workers who had been at the sharp end continued their work, with marginally better funding in some cases, and with the same structural inadequacies in most. The city did not resolve, it persisted. That persistence is, in the absence of resolution, its own kind of answer. Not a good answer, not a satisfying answer, but a human one. There is something almost perversely absurd about the name Monkey Dust. It sounds like something from a children's cartoon, or possibly the name of a low-budget festival act. It carries none of the gravitas that a substance causing acute psychosis, superhuman strength, and long-term neurological damage might be expected to warrant. The name, like bath salts and plant food and legal high, was part of the drug's camouflage, a linguistic softening that made it harder to take seriously, harder to legislate against, harder to explain to a parent or a politician without sounding either alarmist or vaguely ridiculous. There is a reason serious drugs have serious names. When the packaging says not for human consumption, and the street name is Monkey Dust, the very language of the thing is working against you. The nomenclature of synthetic drugs is worth a sustained moment of attention because it tells you something about the market that produced them. Traditional drug names, heroin, cocaine, amphetamine, are serious-sounding words, clinical in register, associated in the cultural imagination with darkness and danger and the weight of history. They do not, when said aloud, produce amusement. They produce either alarm or the specific knowing gravity of familiarity. The synthetic drug market understood from an early point that naming was branding, and branding that minimized threat perception would maximize market penetration. Plant food, bath salts, Happy Joker, Cloud9, Bliss. These are names designed to pass through the filter of concern that serious names would trip. They are, in a very direct sense, marketing decisions. Monkey Dust fits this pattern and then goes one step further into the absurd, which is a place the synthetic drug market seemed to find increasingly comfortable as the years went on. The name generates an involuntary smile before generating concern, and that involuntary smile is a small pause in the normal risk assessment process that a more alarming name would not produce. By the time you've processed the name and adjusted your effect to something appropriate to the substance, you have already been disarmed, slightly, by the comedy of it. This is not an accident. It is, whether deliberately or emergently through the logic of street marketing, an effective mechanism. The irony was compounded by the coverage, which adopted the name wholesale and thereby spread it. Monkey Dust. The zombie drug is a headline that generates clicks precisely because the two halves of it, playful childish name alongside horrifying descriptor, create a cognitive dissonance that is extremely compelling. You click to resolve the dissonance. The clicks validate the framing spreads, and somewhere in this cycle, the substance itself, MDPV, a synthetic cathinone, a drug capable of inducing psychosis and causing organ failure, a drug that was destroying people in a post-industrial English city, was being processed primarily as content, as something to react to rather than something to understand. That gap between reaction and understanding is where policy goes to die. The naming problem also has a solution, imperfect but real. Use the clinical name. Call it MDPV. Call it a synthetic cathinone. Describe what it does in clinical terms that respect the people it affects, rather than spectacularizing them. This is not a demand for clinical dryness in popular communication. It is a demand for accuracy with dignity. The people being described as zombies were patients in a health crisis. The language that described them as monsters was not neutral. It had consequences for the kind of response that was considered appropriate and the kind of support that was considered worth providing. Language shapes response. The cartoonish name was not a small thing. It was one of the mechanisms by which an appropriate response was made more difficult to demand. The harm reduction debate that surfaced around monkey dust was, in miniature, the harm reduction debate that surrounds every drug crisis, and it was just as unresolved. On one side, the argument that criminalizing users did nothing to address addiction, that treating it as a public health problem rather than a moral failure produced better outcomes, that frank information about risks saved lives. On the other, the fear that any acknowledgement of the drug's presence that wasn't accompanied by pure condemnation constituted normalization. The people caught between these positions were the ones actually dealing with users at street level, the community workers, the paramedics, the peer support volunteers, doing harm reduction with whatever tools they had, trying to keep people alive long enough for something better to become available. Harm reduction is not a complicated concept, though the politics around it frequently make it so. Its core proposition is that where abstinence is not immediately achievable, and in the context of active addiction, it very often isn't, interventions that reduce the harm associated with ongoing use are better than no intervention. Needle exchanges reduce the transmission of blood-borne viruses among people who are going to inject regardless of whether a needle exchange exists. Drug checking services allow people to identify what is actually in a substance before they take it, reducing accidental overdose from unexpected adulterants. Supervised consumption sites provide a space in which people can use substances in the presence of trained staff who can respond to overdose. All of these interventions are evidence-based. All of them have been shown in context where they have been implemented to reduce death. The political resistance to these approaches is not primarily evidence-based. It is primarily based on the symbolic politics of appearing tough on drugs, of not wanting to be seen to facilitate, endorse, or accommodate drug use, even where the alternative to facilitation is death. This is a position with a long political history and a very poor public health record. The countries with the best outcomes on drug-related mortality, Portugal being the most frequently cited example, are the countries that moved earliest and most decisively away from criminalisation and toward a public health model. The UK, which has observed this evidence closely and decided repeatedly not to implement its lessons, has watched its drug-related death toll climb to record levels. The specific question in Stoke was not abstract. It was whether providing people with accurate information about what monkey dust was doing to their bodies, what to do if someone's temperature was rising dangerously, what the signs of rhabdomyolysis were, what to do in the acute phases of psychosis, would save lives. The answer, according to the harm reduction workers who were doing this work regardless of the policy debate around them, was yes. Not every life, not the underlying addiction, but the specific, immediate, preventable death from a hypothermia crisis or a cardiac event. Yes, information saved those lives. The question nobody wanted to ask was whether saving those lives was a priority the system was willing to organise itself around, or whether the optics of that organisation were more politically costly than the lives themselves. The harm reduction workers who were doing this work in Stoke were not waiting for the policy debate to resolve. They were in the street, with information and naloxone and phone numbers and the specific kind of persistent human warmth that turns out to be clinically significant. They were doing harm reduction because people were dying, and they could reduce the harm even if they could not eliminate it. The fact that this work had to happen in the gaps, in the margins, without adequate funding and without adequate political support is a comment not on the people doing it, but on the society that required them to. The question is not whether harm reduction works. It does. The question is whether we are willing to say so officially, fund it properly, and stop treating the people who need it as though their lives are an acceptable cost of maintaining the appearance of a hard line. So here we are, at the end of a story that started with a leaf, passed through a laboratory, travelled thousands of miles in a package marked not for human consumption, and arrived on a street corner in the English Midlands for £2. A story about a drug, yes, but really a story about what happens to people when the world stops paying attention to them, and what those people do anyway to get through the night. Think about them for a moment. The worker whose hands had spent 20 years making things, until there were no more things to make. The person on a concrete floor in December because every shelter had a waiting list. The nurse who showed up, again, with the same broken kindness, knowing the system was not adequate and working within it anyway. The recovery worker who sat in a stairwell in Stoke-on-Trent at 4 a.m. and said, quietly, to the person beside them, "You are still here." They are all still there, in the space between the footage that travelled the world and the policies that did not follow. So tonight, as you pull your blanket a little tighter, maybe let yourself be quietly grateful, not in a grand way, just the small, honest kind. The gratitude of having a door between yourself and the cold, of having a brain that will let you sleep without negotiating for it, of living in a version of the world where £2 is what you spend without thinking, not what you spend instead. History is full of people who survived things they were not supposed to survive, without cameras, without anyone writing it down, simply because the alternative was not surviving, and they refused it. Some of the people in this story made it. Some of them are still trying. All of them deserved better than what the world gave them. Sleep well. The world will still need fixing in the morning. But tonight, that is not your job. Tonight you just have to breathe. Close your eyes. Let the dark be soft. You're safe and warm and here.